Today, we're wrapping up our series, 24 Hours That Changed the World. It was a study of a book written by a pastor in Kansas City about the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. So we talked about his Last Supper and the Garden of Gethsemane and his arrest and flogging and crucifixion. And of course, today brings us to Easter Sunday, the resurrection. And we've looked at those details of his life and their historical context. We've learned some things that are surprising at times. We've been challenged. We've found ourselves in his story. We've been encouraged at times, and sometimes in surprising ways as well. And hopefully today is no different. All four Gospels report that the first witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus were women, a group of women who went to the tomb to take spices to the tomb. This was a part of their burial custom. It was a way of honoring this person who had just been buried. And when they arrived at the tomb, they found something different than they expected. And we'll read a short scripture from Luke chapter 24, the Gospel of Luke, and it'll be on the screen. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, a stone that covered the entrance. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And then later in the chapter, like all the Gospels, Luke tells us that Jesus appeared to his followers with a resurrected, a different kind of physical body than the one he had had before, but he could touch them and he could eat and he could interact with them. And so we have this story of the resurrection. During the service last Sunday morning, Aaron did a great job as usual giving the sermon here, and I was in the back and I received a text from a guy back in Ohio where I grew up, and the guy's name is Mitch. And Mitch texts me about once a year because Mitch bought the car that I used to drive right before Hannah and I moved to Arizona to start One Church. It was a 2003 black Honda Accord, leather seats, seat warmers, which is really good if you're in Ohio, stick shift, in-dash navigation. I liked the car. I really, I enjoyed driving. It was a nice car. Mitch is a college student. And I don't know if you've ever made this mistake. I've made this mistake if I'm like test driving a car. If the person selling it knows instantly, they've got you. Have you ever made that mistake? Like you show that you love it a little too much, right? And so this was Mitch when he test drove this car right before we moved here. Mitch has a passionate love affair with this car. And he loves to tinker with the car. He told me it has 221,000 miles on it, still going strong. And he sends me a text every year and tells me how the car is doing. He refers to the car as she. And so I like getting the texts about the car. I mean, I like the car, but I don't like the car the way Mitch likes the car. But I do like getting the texts, and here's why. It's not about the car for me the way it is for Mitch, but it's about what the car means to me. It's about what the car symbolizes to me. It's the car that Hannah and I drove away from the church building in when we got married. It's the car that we took our 5-year-old son home from the hospital in when he was born. And so it's not really about the car to me. I don't have a love affair with the car, but it's about what the car means to me. And I start the sermon on Easter Sunday every year the same way. That when I part of my time growing up, I wasn't in church, about a 10-year period. My parents didn't go to church, but about half of it they did. And I didn't really like Easter Sunday. Isn't that great to put on your resume if you're a pastor? You didn't really like Easter Sunday. And there are a couple of reasons, at least. First, and probably the most important one, like here, we had the Easter egg hunt after the service. So I was like, can we just skip the service and get to the Easter egg hunt every year? Like just one time, could we skip it and get to the Easter egg hunt? But the second reason that I didn't, and this was in, reflecting back on it after growing up a little bit, is that on Easter Sunday, the people in the church we were a part of were very happy clappy. And it's like life was all roses and he's risen, and it's like that solved all the problems in the world, and it's good to celebrate, of course, anything in life. But I just felt like every Easter I heard a story about happiness and everything's good now. And everything's changed, everything's different because of the resurrection. And it just didn't match my view of the world. It just didn't match my experience of the world. That the world is not always happy-clappy. And that there are still problems. And I just didn't quite compute what was so powerful. And the truth is, I had a hard time believing what they wanted me to believe. That was my experience of Easter growing up. And that's a little different if you're a pastor. Maybe some of you here can identify with that. Maybe Easter Sunday kind of feels like that to you. Kind of like, there's a little limbo, in your own mind about Easter Sunday. But what I've realized is that the power of the resurrection in the Christian faith and in my own life, and I think really in anybody's life, regardless of whether they come from a fundamentalist tradition or a liberal tradition or whatever, is the power is in what the resurrection means. What it means to followers of Jesus, what it meant to the first follower of Jesus, and what it means to them now. And I say this every year as well, and I think this is just something that maybe a lot of people don't think about, but I think it's true. If a person in 2016 in Phoenix resuscitated after being gone for a couple of days, the immediate response would not be, oh, this must be the Son of God, the promised Jewish Messiah, foretold in the Old Testament prophets, hundreds of years before he was born. That would not be, you follow me? That would not be the instant reaction. We live in a post-scientific revolution world. We live in a post-enlightenment world, where if something like that were to happen, basically this person would be hauled into a lab, and tests would be conducted on this person to figure out what in the world happened. Are you with me? And so it doesn't have the same meaning in the 21st century world that it had for the first followers of Jesus in the scientific sense. A lot of times people have that question, scientific, sense, did this happen historically? And well, we live in a different world than they lived in. But what it meant to them is what it can mean to us. And so let me ask you this. Have you ever experienced the shock of everything going just fine in your life until it wasn't? Have you ever experienced that? It was just a routine day. Everything was going along just as it usually does, and then you got that phone call, and then it wasn't. Or everything was going along just fine, and then the person said this to you. Or everything was going just fine, and then the doctor said this. And everything was going just fine until it wasn't. In Brussels this past week, there were so many, hundreds of people, but then the day was going just fine, just routine, until it wasn't. Have you experienced the shock of that? That was the shock that these disciples of Jesus experienced. Everything was going along just fine until it wasn't. They saw him teaching to large crowds. They saw him giving people hope and inspiration. And they thought to themselves, this must be what God is like. I see goodness and beauty and peace, and I see a different way of living and a different way of dealing with conflict, and I see people coming together instead of going apart, and I see people being healed. Jesus was known as a healer, and all these amazing things are happening, and everything's going just great until it wasn't. And they lived under the occupation of the Roman Empire and the rule of Caesar, the local governor named Pontius Pilate, and Jesus was quickly arrested, crucified, horribly, and buried. And they must have felt the shock. They must have felt a sense of absurdity. Everything was going amazingly well until it wasn't. And that's the situation that these first followers of Jesus found themselves in. And you put yourself in their shoes, and I think it's kind of easy to do that. They must have thought things like, what could this possibly mean? Why did this happen? Why would God allow this to happen? Could we have done something to prevent? Have you ever asked those questions? What could we have done? And they're trying to make sense of this thing that had happened. And so the earliest Christians understood the death of Jesus within the context of their own faith, the Hebrew faith, the Jewish faith. And they understood that somehow, in some mysterious way, they believed that he had died on their behalf for sins committed or to show a better way of living, that somehow this wasn't a meaningless, absurd event in their lives, but that somehow he had given his life on their behalf. And you have the beginning of Christian theology and understanding of salvation and what it's like to have a relationship with God and all these things. There have been all kinds of theories proposed over the years. But one of the things that this can mean to us in a very practical way in 2016 is that you can determine the meaning of your own suffering. That there's somehow an empowerment and a freedom that when you go through absurdity, when you go through shock and suffering in your life, that you can determine the meaning of that. And the meaning that you determine will set you off on a course, whichever way it is, and there will be goodness and healing and beauty, like the life of Jesus, continuing. Or it could be something that leads you into depression and despair and hopelessness. That you can determine the meaning of your suffering. A theologian named Gustav Alain proposed an answer to why did Jesus die. He called it Christus Victor, that Jesus is the victor, that Jesus won victory over evil. And that in his crucifixion, as he was tortured to death by a violent domination empire who was just bent on killing whoever disagreed with him, that Jesus showed the way to actually bring peace and how a cycle of violence can be ended. And if you really want to have a peaceful society and a peaceful personal life, here's how you respond to conflict. When you're punched, you don't punch in return. You turn the other cheek. When people hurt you, when they crucify you, when they gossip about you, when that shock has come from pain that somebody else has caused you, you can pray something like, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Wow. And that in doing so, he showed us how to overcome evil. And don't we need that in our society right now? And so maybe that's one of the meanings that we could pull out of the suffering and death and resurrection of Jesus, that we can determine the meaning of our own suffering and we can choose how we're going to respond to that. The disciples of Jesus thought their pain was the end of the story. They thought the movie had ended with a sad ending. But the empty tomb sent them off on another direction. Frederick Buechner is credited with saying, resurrection means that the worst thing is never the last thing. That the worst day of your life doesn't have to be the last day of your life. That you can determine the meaning of suffering. And I don't know exactly your story this morning. You could come in thinking, hey, life's great right now. Others may be thinking, it's really hard for me to find hope right now. And if that's you, maybe this can mean something to you today. The worst day doesn't have to be the last day. Last Sunday night, I went to a gathering in Phoenix called the Atheist Church. Exactly where you would expect me to go, right? And I have a friend who leads this gathering. His name is Justin. And it's called the Sunday Assembly. It's a group that's based in London, and they've started congregations around the world now. And there's a Sunday Assembly in Phoenix, and they're the Atheist Church. They're a monthly gathering of people who don't believe in the supernatural, but they believe in community. And they want to come together, and they have usually a guest speaker who speaks some kind of inspiration, usually kind of social justice message. And it was great. It was a great group of people, very nice, very friendly. And I felt I didn't want to tell people what I did because I didn't want to be like that guy who crashes the party. You know what I mean? Like, who invited that guy to come here? Like, why are you here? Who's the mole? You know, is he a spy or whatever? But I'm there because I love Justin. He's my friend. And I like what he's doing, actually. I think goodness is coming out of that. And anyway, the guest speaker was a lady named Sue Ellen Allen. And if you've never heard of Sue Ellen, she has an incredible story. And as she shared this story, I saw goodness and peace and beauty and healing that I rarely see. So Sue Ellen's story is that years ago, she was arrested for securities fraud, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And first she went to jail here in Maricopa County, and then she moved on to her prison sentence. And she was arrested right after she discovered that she had breast cancer. And so right after she was arrested, she had to go to the hospital for a double mastectomy. And after recuperating, they sent her back to they sent her home, but they sent her back to jail with instructions for the corrections officers. Don't cuff her right arm, and she needs a pillow to protect her from lymphedema, I think it's called. It's kind of swelling that happens when you have lymph nodes removed. And so she got back to the jail, and she gave the corrections officer the note, and he said, "You forged this." So they cuffed her. And then there are no pillows. According to her, at least I don't know, but according to her, there are no pillows in the Maricopa County Jail. So she couldn't have a pillow to protect herself against lymphedema. So when the ladies in jail heard this, these ladies were indignant. They, all the other inmates there, they were angry that she was cuffed. They were angry that she didn't have a pillow. And so a bunch of these ladies, and these are ladies who were in jail for a reason. And our society would place certain judgments on these ladies. She said a couple hours later, a group of these ladies came back, and they were holding this. I have a picture of it. They gave this to Sue Ellen. This is a pillow they had made It's a nice looking pillow, isn't it? They made that pillow out of state issue sanitary napkins. They weaved them together. And the ones on the outside, they kind of cut to make fringe around the pillow for her. So she would have a pillow to protect herself against this condition. And so she saw these ladies who were incarcerated acting with empathy and compassion and creatively going and making a pillow for her. These ladies that many people would leave for dead in our society. No resurrection for them. Lock them up, throw away the key. They're irredeemable. Look what they made for Sue Ellen in her time of pain. And then she went on to prison. And the first person she met was her bunkmate, the girl who slept in the bunk above her, and her name was Gina. Gina, I think, was something like 25 years old at the time. And soon after starting her prison sentence, Gina became very sick. And she would tell Sue Ellen, my head hurts so badly, I'm going insane. I have such tremendous pain. I can't take this. And then it progressed. She couldn't get treatment. She told the people, they just didn't get treatment. Wouldn't send her for a blood test. And she got to the point where they were eating, and I can't eat. I feel like razor blades are cutting my throat. And Sue Ellen was in the bottom bunk, and she would hear Gina hitting her head on the wall, trying to make the pain go away. Finally, they decided they're going to take Gina to the hospital. 2 or 3 days later, she died from leukemia. So she had suffered all the way through the stages of leukemia in prison and went to the hospital and fell into a coma. And Sue Ellen eventually got out, and she could have gone back to the business world, could have whatever she could do after this sentence, but she was still a person of capability, person of means. And she decided there are these ladies who have been left for dead, and the same thing is true of men who are incarcerated. And she was talking specifically about Arizona as well, and our high incarceration rates. And she said, these people are redeemable. There can be a resurrection in their lives, not just mine. And so Gina's parents sued the state and won. And with that money, they started, with Sue Ellen leading it, a foundation called Gina's Team. And now they advocate on behalf of inmates in the state of Arizona. They started a program that they offer to women. I think it's in the Perrysville prison. Totally relies on donations and volunteers. And they teach these ladies like leadership principles and like life skills, life management skills. And they've found that while the normal recidivism rate, the rate that people return to prison, is very high, it's something like 2/3. The recidivism rate, easy for me to say, for the people who've been through this program is like 9%. It's an incredible, life-changing, resurrecting program in these women's lives that came out of Sue Ellen's suffering and pain, and out of the pain of these other ladies, too. And so this past January, Sue Ellen was invited, because of her efforts, to be the guest of Michelle Obama at the State of the Union speech. So I have a shot. There's Michelle Obama in the kind of mustard dress. There's Sue Ellen in the light blue jacket. You see her up there to the right? There's Sue Ellen. So she is making such an impact because of her belief in the resurrection that people can experience out of pain, and inmates can experience. That she's doing such beautiful work that it's gained national attention. She could have created meaning out of her suffering that just led her to depression and despair and hopelessness. She could have said, look at this broken world. I'm done checking out. But she decided to create, meaning that led to hope and that led to healing and resurrection in the life of inmates, to the extent that it's this beautiful story that's gotten national attention. If she can do that, what about you? Whatever your suffering is, whatever your pain is, what kind of resurrection meaning can you give to that? The first followers of Jesus saw incredible, hope-filled, inspiring meaning in his death and resurrection. What kind of meaning can you experience? And decide that you are going to adopt for your own in your pain and in your suffering. Next Sunday, Aaron and I are going to start a series called Shattered. And in this series, we're going to talk about just the real-life experiences that we all have when things don't go as you planned, or that thing happens and you feel like your life just shatters into a million pieces. And when that happens, it's also true that we all believe certain things that get us through in life. And when we go through these shattering experiences, those beliefs that we've relied on for our sense of security can come crashing down as well, like a million shards of glass. And so we're going to talk about those things that we often believe that do get shattered when we feel shattered, but we're also going to talk about how out of broken pieces can come new wholeness, just like in Sue Ellen's life. And so some of the topics we're going to be looking at are the beliefs that get shattered in difficult times, are beliefs like everything happens for a reason. We're going to look at that and see, is that really true? And is that helpful? And how is that not helpful at times? Or God helps those who help themselves. Is that really true? Right? Can that be harmful at times? God will never give you more than you can handle. Those little Christianese sayings, that you can hear in church a lot. The Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. For some people, that's a belief that comes crashing down when life is shattered. Or how about this? Love the sinner, but hate the sin. And so we're going to look at these beliefs and these circumstances that can feel like your life is shattering and that fall to pieces when you go through difficult times. We'll also see that out of those broken pieces can come wholeness. Here's a really quick promo for Shattered. So Shattered starts next Sunday. I encourage you to invite friends, and we're going to explore life and how wholeness can come out of brokenness. Lastly, the first followers of Jesus saw in the resurrection that Christ could live on in them, that Jesus lives, and he lives in his followers. There is no such thing as a building that is a church. We talk about church buildings with steeples, and we'll call that a church, but that's actually not what the New Testament teaches church means. And that's convenient if you meet in an indoor trampoline park. The building is not the church. In fact, the church is people. And the Spirit of God or the Spirit of Jesus can live in each one of us. That's Christian theology, that Jesus lives on in his followers. And so a practical meaning of the resurrection for us is that you are already living on in the lives of the people who love you, the lives of the people around you. If Jesus lives in you, you can live on in other people as well before you die, by the way. When we talk about a legacy, we're used to talking about when you die, what kind of legacy are you going to leave? Isn't it really good news that you don't have to die to leave a legacy? Isn't that good news? You're already leaving a legacy in the lives of the people around you, the people who love you, the people you love, people you work with, people you go to school with. You're already influencing them. And you live on in them. So I think like Paul or Peter, the gospel writers, they would say, okay, Jesus can live on in you, and that sounds like a good religious thing to say. And then they would say, well, if it stops there, well, that's nice. That's a nice religious thing to say. But if it stops there, nothing else happens. And so now you and I have the calling, the privilege to live on in the people around us, that we can give life or we can give death. And the way we choose to deal with our own pain and suffering can influence the people around us in a certain way. And we can live in them. And you don't have to die to leave a legacy. I want to wrap up with a couple of stories. One, a story of a lady, a mother, an amazing mom, who did find out she didn't have much time left, and how she responded to that, how she chose to live on in the life of her daughter and the people around here. It's a clip I played about 1.5 years ago, but many of you weren't here at that point, so I wanted to show it again. And then the last story I want to tell is about a guy who has been living and probably will for a long time, a struggling guy, and how he had this realization of how he can live on as well. So first, Erin Cramp was the mother of a little girl named Peyton. And when Peyton was very young, Erin was diagnosed with cancer. And of course, she had a choice about what kind of meaning she would give to this suffering and how she could live on in her daughter's life. And so she had this brilliant idea. Late at night after her daughter would go to bed, she would make videos where she would just look into the video camera and she would just speak out of her life and record those videos for her daughter. And so after she was gone and her daughter got older, she would have these videos for life where she could look at her mom in the face and hear from her mother. And Oprah had Aaron and her husband Doug on the show before she passed away. And then years later, after Peyton had already grown up, Oprah invited them back to talk about the legacy that her mother, Erin Cramp, had left for her. It's about a 4-minute video. Let's check it out. So when you and I experience pain, suffering, we have a choice, whether we realize it or not. And it's easy to say this when you're not suffering, but when you are suffering, it's hard to believe that you can determine the meaning of your suffering, correct? Sometimes it's hard to believe that. But we can choose to experience resurrection. We can choose to see new life and new possibilities out of our suffering. And you're already living on in the people around you. Erin Cramp is living on in her daughter Peyton and her husband because of her choice to determine that I'm going to leave wisdom. I'm going to live on, and I'm going to leave a positive impact in their lives. And I want to close with this. And the second story about a struggling guy is me. And I'm not really the hero of the story. I really didn't do anything. It's something that happened to me that helped me at a time in my life when I was facing something new. Of course, we have our second little boy now. Hannah and I have our little 9-week-old Grady that she's holding right now. We have a 5-year-old named Graham. And before he was born, was facing fatherhood for the first time and felt inadequate to be a dad. I met my biological father for the first time when I was 19 years old. We hung out twice, and honestly, that was enough. And so I felt this inadequacy in my own life, and I was facing, being a dad. And I lived with my grandparents and my mom until I was 6 years old, and I've talked about them so many times here in the history of One Church. You've been around for a while, you're like, oh, here he goes, talking about his grandparents again, geez. But much of what is good in my life, I owe to them. They poured into my life so much. And they both passed away, my grandpa on New Year's Day 1994, my grandma in 2007, before Graham was born. And I don't know how long Hannah was in the pregnancy when this happened, but I remember vividly, and I will remember for the rest of my life. One night I had a dream. It's all in a dream. And in this dream, I was sitting alone in a field, like a farm field, and I grew up around farms. So this is like a view that I would have seen out the kitchen window. Just nothing but a field all the way to the horizon. Completely bare field. And in the middle of the field, I was sitting on a folding chair, kind of like these, only before One Church, right? Sitting in a folding chair in the middle of a field in the middle of the night. It was pitch black. And I felt an extreme sense of grief, of heaviness, of despair. Of just the heaviest grief you can imagine. And this is all in a dream. And I'm thinking, as I'm feeling this grief, that I'm going to be a dad, and my son will never know my grandparents, at least not in this life. He'll never have contact with them, the people who raised me and the people who poured into me. He'll never feel them hug him. He'll never hear my grandma laugh and joke around. He'll never be able to walk in the woods with my grandpa the way I did when I was 3, 4, and 5 years old. They'll never be able to hold him and dote over them like I know that he would. And I was just cut to the heart with grief that he will not know them. How could this, it was all a dream, how could this happen that he cannot know them? I felt an extreme sense of grief. I felt sorry for him that he couldn't experience what I experienced. I felt like that had been taken from him. All in a dream. As I'm sitting in this field on a folding chair, the sun begins to rise behind me. And I have this lifting feeling, this gradual sense of joy, this realization, all in a dream. Wait a second. I was looking at my grandparents as though, they're out here and they're not here anymore, and so they're gone. But as the sun is rising in my dream, I realize my grandparents aren't here, but they're here. And my son can experience my grandparents through me because they made me who I am. They live on in me. They poured into me. They hugged me and laughed with me and gave to me and set an example for me and mentored me and loved me and gave me grace when I didn't think I deserved it. And they gave all these things to me, and he can experience them through me. They live on in me. I wish I always lived up to that dream, that kind of experience that I had that night. But it does guide me. However short I fall, it does guide me. That they live on in me, and that he can experience them through me. So as we face pain and suffering in our own lives, we have a choice. And the resurrection of Jesus says we can head down death and despair and a tomb, or we can look for new life. We can determine what it means. And the choice we make will leave a legacy. It already is leaving a legacy to the people around us. So what is your legacy? How are you choosing to respond to your pain? And what kind of legacy are you leaving right now? Is it a resurrection legacy?